might find that that Mr. Parker is invited back within a month or two to present again, because it would be relevant, a good time to have that debate again.
We shall have a free trade discussion offline.
All right, so Councillor Lee.
Happy to.
Thank you. A very interesting presentation, and I would agree for what it's worth with your conclusion that we're not actually in a bubble as such. But I just want to make some points and ask some questions. It would seem to me that we have an absolute free market, global market in housing and land in New Zealand and in Auckland in particular, with all the pressure that means. But in terms of construction, we have a vertically integrated monopoly, which means our construction prices are significantly higher than Australia and US. Just leave that aside for a minute. When dealing with housing, I'm concerned about a focus solely on land, and I want to ask you, how do you, it may seem kind of a dumb question, but how do you assess the price of land? Is it rural land? Is it developed land ready for construction with all the services and infrastructure in place and the development charges, the resource consent charges, the water care connection charges, etc., etc.? Is that how you measure land, or is it land, undeveloped land?
To the Chair, you raised 2 points, one about the cost of construction and market structure.
Because that also influences the sections ready for building price as well, doesn't it? Because they're sunk into that.
Yes, I'd say the demand for land is the technical terms is derived demand. Land in and of itself is not useful. It's what you can do with it and how that produces welfare. It's a means to an end. And the ability to realise that end is based on the costs to construct, to build homes, to connect to infrastructure networks and the like. So if it costs too much to build, because, say, for example, the issues you raised, that'll feature into the cost of land because people won't want it as much. So the demand decreases, the price will be lower. So they're related and relevant and important. And as for how land is priced, yeah, it depends on how ready it is to build. If there's a long way yet to go, because you were asking about as a function of various stages in its life cycle, that land will become more valuable as it matures through that life cycle.
Okay. Can I think I made a point, but can I say there is an interesting difference, if you like, between you talked about rent, you talked about incomes relative to land. Some people might say, well, incomes in New Zealand have been depressed for years, for many, not for a few, but for many. But it would be interesting to compare average income, which presumably you're working on here, with average income in places like Sydney, where there is also an affordability problem, and the price of land. However you measure it, and it might be useful to measure it kind of a wholesale retail, in a wholesale retail way, and perhaps other comparative cities to see where this differential is coming from in terms of income related to land. Do you think that would be useful to give us more information on this VEX problem?
Yes, it would. There's no shortage of research and analysis that could be done, and I would like to do more. Resources and time is a ever-present issue for anyone. I would like to benchmark further with other countries and cities, particularly Sydney and Melbourne and our neighbouring competing cities. It's always tough to do that because very different jurisdictions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. Just a presentation we had maybe last week from Carl Balderstock, and it was showing that the proposed unitary plan and then the kind of proposals that are starting to come out of it enabled almost double the amount of houses, something like that. I think it was like 54 to 154,000 houses. Is that the kind of shift we need to make the changes you talk about when you're saying that we need to go up and more in than spread across? If I'm not getting that, quite explaining that, but I think in terms of the draft unitary plan, we've talked about that before, and you've talked about that before, that there wasn't enough intensification. Do you think the sort of changes in some of the interim reporting coming out is going to address that somewhat?
To the Chair, yes, it's a good direction of travel. I'm not sure if it's been released to the public what the results of the updated modelling is.
Confidential.
I'm not sure. Yes, the changes to the residential provisions that allow for more development are exactly what is the kind that I think is needed in order to be able to realise what the market is anticipating, so that we can stave off a bust.
Yeah.
More is needed, in my opinion, because when you look at that modelling, it shows a lot more capacity, but it's still, as the Productivity Commission highlighted, like a ringworm. It's still around the outside of the enormous metropolitan area. So some of those issues where land demand is the greatest is still constrained and still need to be worked through. But over the next 6-9 months, when we're looking at the the spatial application of zones, that is an excellent opportunity to drill into that.
Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Walker, Councillor Darby, and then Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate your words here and the liberty, or well, not so much the liberty, but just the inventiveness that you're bringing to your work. I hope the Chief Executive lets you loose. But just going back to this, what are the land value numbers that you're basing this on? Because there's the 14 QVs, those good old boring numbers, that were locked down in mid-14, and those were valuations over the previous 3, 6, 9, 12 months really, and of course the draft was out sort of middle that period. Are you also factoring in the market numbers since the QV numbers? You're basing your analysis on more recent numbers as well?
I will probably need to get back to you on that. I've no doubt that it's founded on the ratings database figures, but as to whether the consultant had taken perhaps the liberty to factor those up based on the percentage across the board increase in property prices, I don't know, so I will check that. But the ratings update was relatively recent, but I take your point that it was based on historical data.
Because the point I'm making there is the market, Aucklanders, really at mid-14, they really didn't have much idea about the proposed Auckland Unitary Plan. And we know that since that point, the land and capital values have increased. But they've also come off low bases in some areas. So has that been factored in? And has the recovery from 08 and 09, so you've got lag, is that factored in? And is it also factored in that in some areas the unitary plan does not signal greater unit growth? There's a lot of single house zones that have still grown exponentially in their capital values. So has that sort of thing been factored in?
I would expect the majority of it has been factored in into the analysis. As I say, that the specific details I will follow up on. I would have expected whatever data was available on house prices most recently was certainly not ignored, knowing the analyst who did the work. take your point too about, and others have raised this with me, that not all houses will be redeveloped. And you see some old heritage houses that are of a similar price, but they're not redevelopable as such. And how do you explain that under this analysis? And I'd say two things. This is a simplified view of the world, so there's always exceptions. The second thing is that those houses, like those classic old houses that will stay as they are most likely, are substitutes for houses now that do have redevelopment potential. So substitutes, as we all know, means that as the price of those developable properties goes up, that increases the demand for those substitutes and bids their price up as well. So you kind of get prices rising like the tide across the board. Not because uniformly everything is the same, but because of that general prevailing issue across the board.
Okay, thank you.
Right, we have Councillor Walker and Councillor Brewer, and that's the last I'm going to take.
Sure, just
Please be brief.
Yeah,
because,
I'll
the
be
reason why we're going to lose a
brief,
quorum
Q
because we've
and
got
A.
3 people who have to go.
Okay, just want to commend you for the analysis. I agree with the comments that Chris Darby's made, that if you extrapolate this for current market valuations, I'd suggest it's even more of a bubble. The other thing that could also be factored in is the impact of special housing areas, which basically bring the impact of the unitary plan to now. And in those areas where you have had those effects, Hobsonville, other places, you've seen huge escalations in value and a great deal of speculation. I'd suggest that it's necessary to do some further work on this, because what it points to is disproportionate capital valuations across Auckland that are going to have a dramatic effect on rate increases in some areas as compared to others. And that is a major issue that we need to get a handle on, and we still do not have a handle on. And Chris is going the closest to it. We need to map that trend out so that we know what impact it's going to have on ratepayers into the future, and I'd suggest it's going to be huge.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Councillor Brewer, too.
Oh, look, I just want to reiterate what I said on Tuesday as far as your comments, Chris, in your commentary about the cuts to the OCR having an impact this winter on residential prices and demand and open homes and everything else in Auckland. And for me, I think there is a space for us as a council to, not that the Reserve Bank will necessarily take any notice of us, but to say, hey, we saw what happened in winter with the OCR cuts. If what the pundits are predicting, successive cuts in September and October, you're arguably going to be pouring petrol onto fire here, albeit, as you've alluded to with the LVR changes and the tax changes and the responsible lending code kind of mitigating some of that. Nonetheless, the government will be clapping its hands and saying, oh, look, we've kind of sorted out this dairy crisis a bit because the rates have fallen. It's great for Taranaki, Southland and Waikato. But for Auckland, before that, we've yet to get the cold breeze coming up from the provinces. And so I have a real concern that we're going to sit by and watch successive OCR cuts in September and October, and it might be great for the Hauras and the Hokitikers, but for Auckland, we will see open home season. If you think winter's been unprecedented, wait till summer when you're going out there, the retail banks promoting 4% interest rates, all 50, 60 year times lows in this environment. So again, I think there is a role for us to not necessarily try and be instructive with the Reserve Bank, but to say, be careful what you wish for, because in Auckland it could have unintended consequences of what you're trying to achieve.
Good comment there, Councillor Brewer, and I'll just let Sue just to wrap up.
Thank you, Mr Chair. A suggestion that, given the interest in this report and your work, Chris, I'd like to invite you, if you're comfortable, to give a further date at the update at the October meeting before you release your next report. And I think that would be very useful to councillors as input into the annual plan. To Councillor Brewer's point you just made about the Reserve Bank, Councillor, I think also, Chris, I'll talk to you offline. I can get you access to some of the work and connected with the economists and the banks and the Reserve Banks. They regularly stress test the bank's books. So if you take that subject up offline with me, I'll help you do that.
Thank you.
So at the October meeting then, Councillor Casey, your questions would be relevant to the last presentation and before the next report comes. So I'm going to move, and I'm thanking the Chief Economist for his presentation. So the seconder is Councillor Darby. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Thank you, Chris.
Very good.
Thank you.
Just as well we've got Chris.
Thank you.
Okay,
Are you talking about Fletcher, eh?
I'm going to move the
this Chris.
requisite resolution to go in
Christopher
confidential.
and
We
Christy.
have a seconder by
Well done,
Councillor
Chris.
Penrose. All those in favour?
Aye.
Right, thank you.
Chris.
We will,
Good stuff.
Right, I'll move, I'm happy to move the, have someone done it? Move the
yep,
confidential
moved and
break.
seconded.
You went
Aye.
to secret meeting, so...
Aye.